Hi everybody. We're going to take our first set of notes for this course, but we're going to do it a little differently. We're going to do it through video since I'm not able to be there with you guys. So you'll still have me there to be able to clarify things and explain it for you a little bit more. I just won't be there with you physically in person. So the way that we're going to go through this, I want to first emphasize our objectives for this. I know that notes aren't always a terribly popular way to learn. But for our purposes, it gives me a chance to basically be able to help you guys do three things. You can evaluate the different approaches or schools of psychology that you've been learning about a little bit through the textbook. You can make an assessment or judgment on how those perspectives end up explaining people's behavior just a little bit differently. And then you're going to end up being able to, at the end of all of this, be able to identify your own approach, the one that you think best explains why you are the way you are and behave the way that you behave. And then how that ends up impacting your grasp of these various different behaviors. So, first thing we're going to talk about is the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic perspective that's going to be established by a guy named Sigmund Freud. So on that packet that you have in front of you, you're going to see various different pieces that are missing from those notes. We call these guided notes. What I want you to do as I move through all of this is just fill in those little blanks for me and then just pay attention as we move along. To best understand psychoanalytic perspective, you have to get to Freud's argument that human beings have three levels of consciousness to their mind. At the very first level is your conscious level. This is a part of your mind of which you are aware of your surroundings. You know what you are doing. You know how you are acting. So what you're doing right now, you're conscious of those actions. So this is the part of your brain that is functioning there. Just below that is something that he called the preconscious. This is a part of your mind where you're not totally aware of what is there, but you can pull it up for yourself, such as memories. There are certain things that you do in your day that you don't consciously have situated in your brain at the forefront right away, like brushing your teeth. It's just something that's really automatic for you. This would be something that's kind of a pre-conscious type of example because you're not totally aware that you're doing it, but if you are able to focus in on it and carry out the motions of brushing your teeth, you're a little bit more aware. Finally, there is the unconscious level of your mind. And this, for Freud, was so important. This is the part of your mind that is totally out of your awareness. And it makes up a substantial size of your brain. So if you look at these levels of consciousness, kind of like an iceberg, it's a little bit easier for you to be able to understand. The largest and most important part of the mind is hidden from our awareness, just like the largest and most substantial part of the iceberg lies under the surface of that water and isn't easily able to be seen. So your conscious then, if you look at it right here, this is the tip of the iceberg. Only about 10% of your mind is in your conscious level of awareness. That's a really tiny amount. Just below the surface, though, is the preconscious. This is what is just under that surface, and this makes up another 10 to 15%. So if you think of it in this analogy, you can see a small part of the iceberg just below the water. You can see it there through it, but you can't see the entirety of the iceberg. So then finally that brings us down to the unconscious level, and this is 75 to 80% of your mind. And this is the part that gets kind of confusing for a lot of people. In your unconscious is a storehouse of sexual and aggressive urges that are conflicting with a large part of the requirements that society and morality say is acceptable, that says that is good. And so it's these urges that are guiding your actions in ways that you're not even remotely aware of. And this is where we had a couple of conversations talking about the Oedipus and the Electra complexes of having romantic attachment toward your opposite sex parent. That was, according to Freud, the explanation behind why children, when they're very young, have a tendency to be very attached to their opposite sex parent. why you have mama's boys and daddy's girls. Now, these unconscious influences, if you're keeping up with me on all of this, Freud argued it was these that direct our behavior. So they influence everything you do, even in ways that you don't recognize. A lot of those come out in what he would call Freudian slips. These are slips of the tongue that have a tendency to be sexual or aggressive in nature, okay? So they just kind of come out without you even realizing that you're saying it. Let's say you want to call down the hallway to a friend and you want to say, wait a sec, but it comes out, wait a sex. You're not consciously thinking about that. It's not in your level of awareness, but it just slips out, even though you didn't realize that that was coming out. So this is what we mean when we say Freudian slips. Another way to get down into those unconscious influences and recognize them is through dream analysis. And we've done a couple of those discussions in class with one another, talking about how the unconscious desires that are present in your mind end up making themselves a lot more noticeable in the dream images themselves. And so you have to interpret those dreams to understand what's going on in your unconscious. One thing to keep in mind about the unconscious influences that Freud so emphasized, what he wanted to take a look at was, initially speaking, psychological problems. Freud was one of the first to look at this issue of abnormal behavior. He looked at what he referenced as nervous disorders. His overall explanation for things was that too many sexual and aggressive urges were building up in these people's unconscious minds. And so as a result, those urges that just weren't getting resolved were showing themselves in abnormal and kind of strange kinds of behaviors. So that's that. How Freud studies the unconscious is kind of interesting. And we're going to actually do an activity with this in class together to help you understand how it was that Freud was able to pull out all of these urges that people were never even remotely aware that they had. What he would use was something called free association. He would tell his patients to say whatever came to mind and to never ever edit or censor their thoughts when he would provide them with a word. Because his role as a psychoanalyst was to listen to that person objectively and then interpret the associations or connections in their thought processes. So, if he were to pose the word school to you, and you didn't edit or censor your thoughts, and it just came out hate, Freud would argue there is some kind of connection there in your unconscious, and so he would try to help you work at understanding why you act or feel the way that you do towards school based off of those unconscious influences. Now, another key component to this, and your book does emphasize it, is that Freud believed personality is shaped by your early childhood experiences. What happens to you when you are little very much ends up mattering later on in your adult life. It explains a great deal. Oftentimes, this is why, for example, so many people end up developing phobias. Most of us develop that fear of that object or item or thing when we're very little. And so then it ends up finding its way and influencing our adult behavior later on. And I'll give a personal example to this. When I was 10 years old, my older brother had me watch the movie Arachnophobia. And it's with these killer spiders, and it's this terribly cheesy horror movie. But at 10 years old, I wasn't really able to make that distinction on things. And so these spiders scared the bejesus out of me. And so every point from then, when I'm presented with spiders, I have a physical reaction to that. I don't like spiders. And there's a part in the movie where there's an older woman who's sitting there on a couch eating popcorn. And she goes to turn the lamp off next to her so she can have it darker in the room as she's watching TV. But what she doesn't realize is there's a spider crawling down that lamp. And so ever since I saw that, I can't just turn off the light on a lamp without looking right under the shade. I have to see and make sure, is there a spider under there? And so Freud would emphasize that that is why I developed that particular action and that part of my personality, because it happened to me in early childhood, and so it found its way to me later on as an adult. As a lot of us have kind of discussed as we've moved through some of our discussions with Freud, his views are very, very, very controversial. You just can't scientifically test what he says to be legitimate. So for the most part, modern psychology doesn't necessarily use many of his theoretical assessments, but because he was such an important contributor to modern psychology, we do talk about him within the field. Now, behaviorism is a different kind of field to this. Behaviorism is something in complete opposition to Freud. It actually developed in reaction to Freudian teachings. Behaviorists argue that there's no such thing as an unconscious mind. There's no part of your brain that you are not aware of. For behaviorists, what needs to be the crucial component of psychological study is observable facts and behaviors. So you have to look at a person's environment, their experiences, and their surroundings in order to be able to understand why a person acts the way that they do. So everything in life is learned then. You're not born with your behaviors. You learn them over time. You will acquire them through certain experiences, especially when it comes to two key components. All behavior, according to guys that you just saw like J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, they argue that behavior is learned through either a reinforcement or a punishment. So a reinforcement is just a fancy word for reward. If behavior is rewarded, it's going to continue. Think about it. If your parents pay you to get good grades, more than likely you're going to continue that action. Okay? If you go to work and you get money for that time that you invest, more than likely you're going to keep going to work so that way you have that money, that reward there at the end of the day. The other end to this is punishment. In theory, punishment for behavior causes the behavior to stop. And we say in theory basically just because teenagers are a little different to this rule. A lot of times punishment doesn't necessarily work for you because the behavior that is being punished by your parents tends to be rewarding for you. It tends to give you some level of happiness. Okay, you break curfew to go spend time with your friends. That's a reinforcement that you're giving yourself. So punishments don't necessarily work all the time for every person, and that's very important to recognize. Now, humanism, on the other hand, is a slightly different approach to all of this. Humanists believe that each person has the freedom in directing their future and achieving their personal growth, okay? So for humanists like this guy's right here, Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, the big thing to emphasize is you are born with a natural drive to be superior, to be your best at whatever it is that you want to be your best at. Everybody's different in that regard. Okay, my level of personal growth isn't necessarily going to be the same level of personal growth that you feel that you need to be able to achieve. So for these guys, you don't just desire to be a failure. You're not wired that way. For them, the key component to this is that we all strive for some level of superiority, and that presents itself in something called self-actualization. This concept of being all that you can be. We're the only species on the planet that has a soul and a capability to reason. Okay, we have much higher level functionality in our brains than any other kind of animal on the planet has. So, for humanists then, we determine our own fate through decisions that we make. No outside external forces determine things for you. So for seniors, as you move through trying to determine what it is that you want to do with your life after you graduate from here, many of you guys might be applying for college. Many of you may feel that your ability to get into that college is based off of whether the admissions people like you, or they find that your application is good, and so you don't necessarily have any determination over your ability to be admitted there. But for humanists, they would argue you absolutely do have determination over your future with that. You can achieve the best of your ability. You can be all that you can be, so that way you can earn that position at the college of your choice. One of the issues with humanism that's really important to recognize is that it's the least scientific behavioral approach to prove. Okay, it's really, really, really hard for us to be able to say that each person has achieved personal growth because everybody's different. And the fact of the matter is, we can't scientifically test this in order to make it so that we can determine one way or the other that yes, a person has achieved personal growth. So within this, it's really, really hard for us to be able to accept in the field of psychology that humanism is the good way to go. But it hasn't stopped a lot of people from particularly latching on to this perspective and agreeing with it pretty heavily. When we all get back together with one another, you guys are going to do a quiz for me, so to speak, where you're going to be able to see where you lie in terms of these varying different perspectives. And many of you guys actually will argue that you are part of the humanistic perspective.